Here's a gentle, thoughtful hook that sets the tone for the speech in a Mr. Rogers-inspired style. Have you ever watched the same story unfold over many years, so long that it becomes part of the background of your life? Some stories are loud, filled with headlines and images. Others are quieter, carried in the hearts of people who live them. Today, I want to talk with you about one of those stories. It lasted for 20 years, touched millions of lives, and left behind lessons we're still trying to understand. It was called a war, but it was also something more. On September 11, 2001, al-Qaeda operatives hijacked 4 commercial airplanes and launched coordinated attacks against the United States, crashing 2 into the World Trade Center towers in New York, 1 into the Pentagon, and 1 into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers intervened. Almost 3,000 people lost their lives that day, leaving families shattered and a nation in mourning. The world watched disbelief and hearts united in grief. The scale and horror of those attacks transformed American public opinion overnight and created an urgent demand for action. Within days, President George W. Bush declared a global campaign against terrorism, identifying al-Qaeda as the primary target and accusing the Taliban government in Afghanistan of harboring its leaders. On October 7, 2001, U.S. forces joined, with British and other allied troops, to begin Operation Enduring Freedom, striking Taliban positions, al-Qaeda training camps, and military bases across the rugged Afghan terrain. The initial phase combined airstrikes and special operations with support from the Northern Alliance, a coalition of Afghan fighters opposed to the Taliban. Swift advances by these allied forces led to the collapse of Taliban rule in Kabul by mid-November, but the campaign quickly evolved into a complex counterinsurgency struggle. From the outset, military planners had to contend with Afghanistan's mountainous landscape, a decentralized tribal society, and an enemy skilled in guerrilla tactics. Efforts to stabilize the country and build a new government demanded not only combat operations but also reconstruction, training of Afghan security forces, and humanitarian assistance. Despite early successes in disrupting al-Qaeda's leadership and dismantling training facilities, the seeds were sown for a protracted conflict as Taliban remnants regrouped and insurgency spread. This beginning marked a profound shift in U.S. foreign policy, redefining national security priorities and setting the stage for the longest military engagement in American history. The war in Afghanistan began in October 2001 and officially ended in August 2021, making it the longest military conflict in U.S. history, lasting nearly 2 full decades. Over the course of these 20 years, 4 different American presidents, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, oversaw the war, each bringing shifts in strategy, goals, and public messaging. What started as a focused mission to dismantle terrorist networks gradually expanded into a broader effort to stabilize Afghanistan and establish a democratic government, a shift that extended the timeline far beyond original expectations. As the years passed, troop levels fluctuated dramatically. At its height, over 100,000 U.S. troops were stationed in Afghanistan, working alongside NATO allies and Afghan forces. Military operations transitioned from intense combat to training missions and support roles, but the conflict never fully subsided. Instead, it became a grinding and persistent presence, often referred to as a forever war. U.S. forces engaged in countless skirmishes, airstrikes, and patrols, and despite major tactical victories, a lasting strategic success remained elusive. Efforts to defeat the Taliban insurgency were met with constant setbacks as the group continued to gain strength and territory. Domestically, support for the war waned over time as the human and financial costs mounted. Thousands of American lives were lost, tens of thousands more were wounded, and trillions of dollars were spent. Many Americans, especially younger generations, grew up knowing nothing but a country at war. Despite technological superiority and vast resources, the United States struggled to fully understand or influence Afghanistan's complex political and cultural landscape. The final chapter came in 2021, when U.S. forces completed their withdrawal. Almost immediately, the Afghan government collapsed, and the Taliban returned to power. This long war left behind a legacy of sacrifice, debate, and unresolved questions about the limits of military intervention. The human cost of the war in Afghanistan was immense and deeply felt on all sides. For the United States, more than 2,400 service members lost their lives, and over 20,000 were wounded, many with injuries that would change the course of their lives forever. Beyond the visible wounds, countless veterans returned home carrying the invisible weight of post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injuries, depression, and moral injury. Families of those who served endured long periods of separation, fear, and sometimes grief, as the war stretched on with no clear end in sight. Among coalition forces, thousands more were killed or injured, with countries like the United Kingdom, Canada, and others in NATO paying their own tolls. For the Afghan people, the suffering was even greater. Civilian casualties mounted year after year, with tens of thousands killed and many more injured or displaced. Families were caught in the crossfire between Taliban insurgents, foreign military operations, and internal Afghan conflict. Entire communities were uprooted by fighting, drone strikes, suicide bombings, and the slow erosion of public infrastructure. Access to healthcare, education, and clean water was often disrupted, especially in rural regions. Afghan children born after 2001 grew up knowing war as a constant part of life, many experiencing trauma from a young age. Journalists, aid workers, and interpreters who supported U.S. efforts often faced threats to their safety, and many were killed or forced into hiding. The emotional burden extended far beyond the battlefield. In the United States, debates over the war's purpose and its progress became a regular feature of political discourse, affecting public morale and trust in leadership. For those who served, for those who lived through it, and for those who lost someone, the war left behind more than statistics. It left behind pain, pride, memories, and questions that remain deeply personal. When the United States first entered Afghanistan in 2001, the goal was narrowly defined: dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban regime that had provided sanctuary to its leaders. In the early months, that objective appeared to be successful. The Taliban government was quickly overthrown, and al-Qaeda's training camps were destroyed. However, as the initial phase of combat ended, U.S. leadership began to expand the mission into something far more complex, rebuilding the Afghan state and transforming it into a functioning democracy capable of defending itself against future threats. This shift marked the beginning of a long and often unclear strategy known as nation building. The effort included writing a new constitution, holding elections, training Afghan security forces, and investing in infrastructure, education, and public services. Over time, U.S. and NATO forces found themselves not only fighting insurgents, but also trying to support civil society, manage development projects, and navigate a deeply rooted web of tribal, ethnic, and political divisions. Corruption within the Afghan government became a persistent issue, undermining public trust and weakening efforts to establish stability. Meanwhile, the Taliban adapted, regrouped, and launched a sustained insurgency, often blending into the population and using Afghanistan's geography to their advantage. The lack of a consistent, long-term plan for what success would actually look like made it difficult to measure progress. Each new U.S. administration reevaluated the mission, sometimes increasing troop levels, other times pushing for withdrawal, leading to fluctuating strategies and mixed messages. As the war wore on, military leaders and policymakers often debated whether the United States was trying to do too much in a country with deeply rooted challenges. The goal of building a self-sufficient democratic Afghanistan eventually collided with the reality of local politics, historical grievances, and cultural complexities that foreign powers struggled to fully understand or influence. Despite years of military presence and enormous investment, the Taliban steadily regained strength during the U.S. war in Afghanistan. In the early years following their removal from power, the group went into hiding, particularly in rural areas and across the border in Pakistan, where they found sanctuary and resources to regroup. As time passed, they adapted their tactics, avoiding direct confrontation with superior U.S. and NATO forces and instead relying on guerrilla warfare, ambushes, roadside bombs, and targeted assassinations. Their influence slowly spread through Afghanistan's countryside, especially in provinces where the Afghan government had weak presence or where corruption and poor governance alienated local populations. By exploiting tribal tensions, economic frustrations, and religious sentiment, the Taliban were able to recruit fighters and establish shadow governments in many areas. While U.S. and allied forces focused on building up the Afghan military and conducting counterinsurgency operations, the Taliban patiently built networks of control in rural regions and continued to launch high-profile attacks in cities, undermining confidence in national security. Efforts to train and equip Afghan security forces were complicated by low morale, desertion, and a lack of trust in leadership. Even as peace talks began in later years, the Taliban continued military operations, signaling that they intended to regain full control. By the time the United States began its final withdrawal in 2021, the Taliban were already poised to seize power. Their rapid advance during the final months caught much of the world by surprise, but it reflected years of careful planning and a political environment in which many Afghans no longer believed their government could survive without foreign support. In a matter of weeks, provincial capitals fell one by one, and by mid-August the Taliban entered Kabul without facing significant resistance, reclaiming control nearly 20 years after being driven out. The war in Afghanistan left a lasting imprint on the United States, Afghanistan, and the broader international community. For the United States, it reshaped foreign policy by highlighting the limits of military power in achieving long-term political outcomes. What began as a mission of counterterrorism evolved into a prolonged conflict marked by shifting strategies, uncertain goals, and growing public fatigue. The war spurred debates about the effectiveness of interventionism, the burden of nation-building, and the human and economic costs of extended military engagement. It also influenced how future conflicts would be approached, with a greater focus on drone warfare, intelligence operations, and minimizing large-scale troop deployments. Veterans returning home brought with them experiences that shaped how the country viewed issues like mental health, military support, and reintegration into civilian life. In Afghanistan, the war upended everyday life for an entire generation. Some progress was made. Millions of girls were able to attend school, and a new class of Afghan professionals and civil society leaders emerged. But much of that progress was fragile and heavily dependent on international support. The sudden collapse of the Afghan government in 2021, just days after U.S. forces withdrew, erased much of that optimism and left many Afghans in fear and uncertainty, especially women and those who had worked with foreign organizations. Globally, the war affected how allies and adversaries perceived American resolve and reliability. The chaotic final withdrawal raised questions about planning and commitment, even as many agreed it was time for the conflict to end. For policymakers, scholars, and citizens alike, the war became a source of reflection about when, why, and how to use military force. Its legacy continues to be written, not only in official records and speeches, but also in the memories of those who lived through it and the choices made in its aftermath. Here is the conclusion for the entire speech, tying together the key themes in a warm and reflective tone. So much happened over those 20 years: loss, courage, change, and questions that don't always have easy answers. The war in Afghanistan touched millions of lives, near and far. It showed us how complicated the world can be, how intentions and outcomes don't always match, and how deeply people can suffer and hope at the same time. As we look back, it's important to remember not just the history, but the people within it. The soldiers who served with bravery, the families who waited, the civilians who carried on with everyday life in the middle of something so difficult. Their stories matter, and so does what we learn from them. When we talk about the past with honesty and care, we give the future a chance to be a little wiser, a little more compassionate. Maybe that's one way we honor all those years, not only by remembering what happened, but by choosing to do better with what we know now.